a casual object dodger with beautifully crafted artwork which fits perfectly with the theme. Neon Drive is a beat-driven rhythm runner based in a cyberpunk neon-laden universe with 80s artwork and riffs. The setting is perhaps the biggest draw for this game, as the art effortlessly enchants viewers using copious amounts of colour and references to large-scale 80s icons to invoke the strongest of rose-tinted memories. Everything from the menu draped in neon lights and wedge-shaped sports cars to the large skyscraper cities with lanes of hover cars travelling in all directions is awesomely accurate and stripped straight from the sci-fis of the same era. It undoubtedly executes the art direction absolutely perfectly, as every moment the background switches in time with the music or some fantastic transition between the game style captures your attention, it distracts you from what you're actually supposed to be doing. In many ways, the constant distraction and the copious amounts of colour bombarding the screen are a part of the challenge, and the fact that they are generally well thought out and varied throughout the level make it a somewhat acceptable interruption. The levels each begin with very similar car swerving sections between obstacles, but often evolve into something very different with a sequence with no other aim than to look awesome, which it always pulls off perfectly. The only thing that detracts from this is the fact that the checkpoints are almost always placed just before the transition, meaning you're almost guaranteed to see it multiple times, and if you struggle with a section, it's going to lose its impact the more times you see it. In terms of gameplay, there is nothing unusual here other than the multiple styles borrowed from the various game types in the genre. It all boils down to using left and right to dodge or hit obstacles coming towards you or going across in front of you. There's elements from the likes of Super Hexagon, Audio Surf, and even Bit Trip Runner, and really add nothing into the way in which they play out. Most of them are mechanically solid examples of the source of influence, but direct copies nevertheless. Most of the games in question have a very simplistic art style with a focus more towards the gameplay, whereas here the art is the main feature, and the gameplay is somewhat of an afterthought. This is most noticeable in the latter stages of the game. In level 6 you end up flying a jet down a pipe-style arena, except all the obstacles are identical and make it very difficult to differentiate and identify the points in which you need to change direction, but graphically it's almost hypnotic. But nothing more obviously shows the lack of focus on gameplay as level 7, in which you run through a usual car section and transform into what is essentially the head of Optimus Prime on a generic Transformer body. The animations are a little bit janky, and you still use the right and left to control the vertical movements, which initially causes a fair amount of confusion, but the level itself is incredibly difficult, as it is very difficult to judge sizes and movements as you travel through it. After 200 attempts and slowly going mad to the point where I was starting to think that the neon lights look a little bit like toaster elements, the game had lost the vast majority of its shine. The fact that I willingly tried this many times implies to me that it tickled the same part of me that wanted to complete Bit Trip Runner, except in this case I eventually gave up. To me, a signal that once the glow has been worn away, the game can't stand on its own 2 feet. The soundtrack is fantastic, and on some levels it matches up perfectly with the music, as you might hope given that the levels are crafted to fit it in, but there are definitely some parts which are questionable in terms of the way it syncs up. Basically, if you like this simplistic arcade style button mashing game and the art style, you'll fall madly in love with it, but other than that it doesn't have a huge amount to offer. In total it has 7 levels and 3 difficulties for each, which means it has some replayability, but I don't see people getting a great deal more than 5 hours out of it, and potentially significantly less if they're good at it. It tries to make up for this slightly by having an endurance mode, which is a run through of each of the levels in turn with no checkpoints, and you score points based on the time that you go for. But this really doesn't add that much more other than a little extra challenge. I can completely expect a lot of people who aren't into the whole 80s revival thing not understanding or not liking it, as it totally relies on you loving this, which fortunately I do, and eagerly await any more games with a similar art direction. The game isn't exactly expensive, but in a market which is littered with similar games for much less, unfortunately I think it is somewhat devalued. It executes what it intended well, but it's worth waiting for it to drop down to a couple of pounds at the most. I feel like level 7 might have put me off games like this for a while.